Hello, and welcome to Good News Rhode Island, the show about Rhode Island and you and all the people that are making Rhode Island a great place to live. We talk about butchers and bakers, and now we talk about violin makers today. We're going to be talking with Dennis McCarten, who's here, who owns a violin shop and is making violins right here in Rhode Island. And we want to thank Tony Gutierrez, A.O. Gutierrez, who's here playing for us today. His fiddle, which I learned today, is the same as a violin. But anyway, thank you, Tony. And I wonder how you got started in playing.
My cousin took me to a folk festival, excuse me, in the early 70s, and I saw a couple of fiddle players and decided, well, I could do that, and I still haven't caught up yet. So I'm getting close.
But, you know, fiddle players always have the next fastest rhythm, right? And the next fastest trill. And it seems to me that there's always something that's pulling somebody forward to learn more.
Oh, you can always improve.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, and we'll hear from you again at the end of the show. Thank you. And Dennis.
Hi.
So, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Oh, you're welcome.
I have been to your shop at Hope Artiste Village and have marveled that these instruments are handmade. Yep. And so today you're going to help us to understand how that is. But first I want to ask you, how long have you been a violin maker, and are you a violin maker by trade or by passion? Or?
Well, my current job is violin maker, violin restorer, violin repairer, and dealer. And it's my full-time job. I'm still a part-time lawyer. I took up violin making perhaps 20 years ago as a hobby, and initially was self-taught, and learned in relatively short order that you can't make a very good violin if you teach yourself how to do it. There was very limited resources around, mostly old books printed in the 19th century about violin making, and I collected those. I collected old violins, and I had my own morgue where I would take old violins apart to study their anatomy, and as I said, tried and failed to teach myself to make a nice violin.
That's interesting in itself, that you really have to be trained.
I feel
what the eye sees is not all that there is, I guess is what it is.
There are some exceptional makers that have lived or are living now who are self-taught, but by and large, it really is, you have to learn violin making as a complete immersion into the craft. In the old days, of course, it was done as an apprenticeship. Nowadays, in this country, there are 3 full-time programs you can attend, and I decided 2003, that I would leave my job as an attorney and go to Boston every day for 3 years to the North Bennett Street School, where I learned the craft of violin making.
And as a lawyer, you just decided there's something I've always wanted to do, and this is the day. I need to just start it.
It was a complicated process, as you can imagine, because I'm still an attorney, and I still practice occasionally, doing limited work. But I was a trial lawyer, and it was a very stressful career, but it was a rewarding one. But the violin had always fascinated me. And I can't account for that. And I think if you talk to any violin maker, they'll tell a similar story. Some point in their life, they fell in love with this object. And they can't tell you why or where it came from. And the major influence in 2003, when I decided to quit law and go to school again, was the fact that I was 53. I had my health. And I really, really wanted to do this. And I was afraid that if I got to be 70 years old and the hands didn't work as well as they did when I was 53, that I would just not forgive myself. It was, quite honestly, that was the most important consideration at the time.
I bet there are people watching who feel that same way. Gee, I've always wanted to, whatever it is, and it's hard to take that leap. Now, you have a shop now, and the name of the shop is?
McCarten Violins.
McCarten Violins,
Yep.
in Pawtucket.
In Pawtucket.
In Hope Artiste Village.
Yep.
You are in the line of a very venerable trade.
Yep.
Possibly if you search long enough, you find out it started in Italy, or maybe before that with the lute, and then...
Well, I think the bowed stringed instruments probably originated in the Middle East, in Arabic lands, and migrated into Europe. There's some debate over where the first violin was. Now, the violin, of course, is a 4-string, fretless instrument. And in all, the best scholarship indicates that the first violin was created in Italy in the mid-1500s. There are records that Andrea Amati created a set of instruments for the French court in around 1560. Beautiful decorated violins, which still exist, by the way, which are perhaps the first known examples of what we call a violin.
And then music had to be written for them, is that right?
Oh, yeah.
New music.
Yeah.
So somebody in the French court...
Well, some form of instrument must have existed before that for them to ask for these things. Mm-hmm. So we don't have a good history, a good detailed history of the exact evolution of this instrument, but certainly by 1560.
Is it related to the viola?
Oh yeah, the viola is a...
Is it a precursor? Is the viola a precursor?
No, viola d'amore, there were other instruments that are quite different and have more strings or have frets. But the viola, as we know it today, is an instrument in the violin family, but it's larger. It's tuned 1/5 lower. We don't have to get into music theory, but where the bottom string in a violin is a G, the viola has a C string below that. And then below that is, of course, the cello, which is also in the same family of instruments. And it's an octave below the viola.
So could you tell us how you make a violin? I have no idea. We need to talk for a little bit at some point about the history more, but could you tell me a little bit about how you make a violin? Well,
the violin as we know it today was pretty much perfected by Antonio Stradivari in Cremona, Italy. He had a very long career. I think he died when he was 92, and he probably started making instruments in the 1680s. And by varying counts, made anywhere from 600 to 1,100 instruments. So what we do today, thanks to a lot of research and scholarship and people that have studied his instruments intensively, is most modern makers make violins according to the methods developed in Cremona, Italy, at the time of the Amati family, the Amati family, and Antonio Stradivari and Giuseppe Guarneri, Guarneri and Stradivari were the two greatest makers of all time, who worked 2 blocks apart in the city of Cremona at the same time. It's just amazing that those two just the ultimate instrument makers worked at the same time in the same town.
So do you know that they knew each other, or they shared
Oh, we
secrets?
assume they did, of course, yeah.
And is this the
So-
time of Vivaldi? I think of...
No, I don't.
Some, okay.
Boy, you got me. I'm not
okay. I was just
So-
thinking of some of the Four Seasons has wonderful violin.
Oh, those, yes.
And so-
Oh, the whole Italian book of music is full of violins.
Okay, I'm
But
changing the subject.
in Cremona, Italy, they have preserved a lot of the tools and molds and materials that Antonio Stradivari used in making instruments. And all I wanted to show you from this book is, for example, there are copiously documented, mostly by photography, pictures of Antonio Stradivari's molds. These are the wooden forms that he built violins on. And there was a man named Pollard who actually was a curator at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, who published a book, a complete folio of 100% photographs of these forms that Stradivari himself used. So if you wanted to make a copy of a Stradivari instrument, you'd probably start with Pollard's book, which is what I did in this instance. This is doesn't show well on camera, I'm sure, but this is a photocopy of what is called the P form of Antonio Stradivari. Now it's cut in half because we want to make a symmetrical instrument, so we're using only the left half of his form. It's a photocopy that is mounted on a sheet of aluminum, and this becomes a template. And just to go through the process quickly, once you have a template from Antonio Stradivari's collection.
Excuse me, and you
Yeah.
told me that he had signed this.
Yeah, you can see
the
his
original,
handwriting.
And so you can see it here.
You can see the Antonio. Stradivari is on the other side over here. So from that template, I can make a mold that is similar to the one that Antonio Stradivari had. And I just put my own legend on here to indicate when I made it, back in 2006, but that this is Antonio Stradivari's P form. And this form becomes the basis for the violin. This determines its ultimate shape. These cutouts receive blocks of wood that are glued in place temporarily. The ribs or the sides of the violin are bent to fit around this mold. And I have a completed violin here, which
That
might
would be very interesting to see. I'll
might be
hold this up for a
instructive.
minute.
So
My hands up.
with that mold in mind, let's open up a completed violin. This is one that actually, it's a very nice German violin from the 1920s. It's in my shop for repair. And if you put it next to the mold, you can see the similarities. The blocks of wood that would have been glued here into these spaces are now an integral part of the violin. They stay in place. There's a cutout at the top and at the bottom, and those blocks of wood are still in the violin. And after the blocks are glued and the ribs or the sides of the violin are bent and glued into place, this mold would then be removed. And then the top and the back of the violin would be created.
Do you use water at all?
Use a little bit of, yeah. It's, people often think that the curved shapes of the violin are accomplished by bending the wood. And actually that's not the case at all. These parts, the top and the back of the violin, are carved with sharp curved tools. The sides of the violin, though, are made of thin strips of maple. And this is a piece of maple that will become, this wood on the table is going to become a viola, hopefully very soon. But these thin pieces of wood will become the sides, and there is a little moisture and heat that is used to bend this and to bend it into the shape of a violin
Because this is a
side.
very elaborate shape for one piece of wood.
It is. In fact, there are 6. If you look at the rib structure of a violin, there are actually 6 pieces of wood. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. And first you carve these middle curves because they're very sharp curves, and you glue them to the form. Then you work on the bigger curves at the top and the bottom. But these ribs are the only part of the violin that are actually bent into shape with heat.
You're watching Good News Rhode Island, and it is our turn to talk with violin maker Dennis McCarten, who's here telling us his trade, which is really interesting. So what happens if you make a mistake and you put a little too much thickness in the wood, say at the head of the violin?
Well,
I mean, it must all have to be exactly the same thickness.
it's got to be very, well, it's another thing that has been studied very extensively by various scholars. And one of the things that is very well documented are the various thicknesses of every part of a violin, especially the violins made by Antonio Stradivari. On the violin top, which I'm holding here, the thickness in the middle might be 2.5, maybe 2.8 millimeters, and it might thin out to about 2.4 millimeters around the edges. But the difference is less than 0.5 millimeter in thickness. The back, however, is a different case because it has to be a little bit stronger. The middle of the back of a violin is probably 3.5 or 4 millimeters thick, and that tapers out to about 2.5 millimeters at the edges. And all of this is a craft that was developed over hundreds of years. And all of these measurements that I'm telling you about now really were developed in the time of Stradivari in the late early 1700s, and really have remained largely unchanged since then. Nobody has really conceived of a better construction method. People have gotten experimental with the designs of the openings or the design of the headstock or things like that, but nobody has ever really devised a better way to shape the body of a violin.
And it's carved. I'm
carved.
Absolutely in awe of that.
I even brought one of the sharp tools that we would use to carve out the inside of these shapes. It's a curved gouge that would be used to literally shovel the wood out of the original block of wood.
And then there's a lot of sanding, I assume.
Well, violin makers pride themselves on not using sandpaper, although sometimes we cheat. But
I won't tell.
We prefer to use sharp instruments. We have little planes like this. This is a very sharp blade. It's a curved blade on a curved bed, which is used to smooth out the inside of these parts after we do the rough carving with the gouge. And then after this is done, you still have little ridges of wood that the plane leaves, and you would use a sharp scraper to remove those.
I understand that a lot of testing has been done on the original violins and the Stradivari, and they're still unsure about a lot of things, but there are a lot of variables: the thickness of the wood, the kind of wood, the density of the wood itself, and how it grew, the varnish, the kinds of string that you use. It's amazing.
Well, if you want to start with the wood, Stradivari fortunately lived in a part of the world where there was great wood available. Not too far from the foothills of the Alps in northern Italy. And there was a lot of very old growth maple and spruce, which are the main components of a violin. And this is a piece of spruce that came from the Carpathian Mountains. This is probably 20 years old. It was just split from a tree. You can even still see some of the bark on the side of this piece. And this is going to become a viola top. This is a piece of spruce that will become the top of a viola, like the top of this violin.
And it will be just as thin.
Yeah.
Can you make 2 or 3 out of that?
No. This is a single violin top or viola top. And this weighs probably, 7 pounds?
Yeah, it's heavy. Yeah. I mean, it's not
5
heavy,
or 6
but,
pounds.
yeah.
But after all that work is done, this is what's left, and you can tell people just how light that is.
It's featherweight.
You could send it with 1 stamp, probably. Yeah. And the same as for the back of the violin is made of maple, which is very, beautiful and dense hardwood. And I hope the camera can pick up that the figure that is in this piece of wood, again, which was harvested in Europe and is probably, the piece of wood alone is probably worth $200.
Can you see that? I don't know if you can see it, but it's drawn here, and you can see what was this called?
Well, we call it flame.
Flame?
Yeah, it's
flame
just
maple.
this particular genus of maple gives us beautiful figured appearance. And that'll be a single violin or viola back. And that weighs, what twice as much as
Yes.
the piece of spruce I showed you. And in the same way, a neck of a violin is carved from a wedge of
so
wood
this
like
part.
this. Yep. And so here you got 2 pounds of wood that probably becomes 6 ounces of wood. So somebody made a crack that we're in the business of making wood chips, and violins are the byproduct. Because a single violin probably accounts for a trash bag full of shavings.
So you stay warm with the,
You could. Yeah.
the excess.
Yep. Good kindling.
If someone comes to you and wants to buy a violin, I understand that you talk with them and then you decide what violin you should make for them. That seems impossible to me.
Well, very often, if somebody's coming to have a violin made for them, they have a definite, because they're going to spend a lot of money for it, and they usually have very definite criteria in mind. And most often they ask they're looking for sound qualities. They're looking for something that sounds bright and brilliant, or dark and bassy, perhaps, or something that's more moody. And the outline of the violin can contribute to that. The way the wood is carved, and as you're carving the parts of a violin, you're constantly tapping it to listen to the tone. And you can never predict exactly how the instrument is going to sound when it's done, but there are certain variables you can control. For instance, Giuseppe Guarneri, who was the other maker in Cremona in the late 1600s and early 1700s with Stradivari, his instruments have a reputation for being dark and more sonorous than Strads or Stradivari's, whose instruments are thought to be more brilliant and soaring.
Lyrical, soaring.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. So the composers that you are drawn to might affect the kind of instrument you ask for.
The kind of music you're playing would certainly influence the kind of instrument you'd want to own. And in fact, most of the great players, Itzhak Perlman, Isaac Stern, owned one of each. Those players have Strads and Guarneris, and they would choose the instrument based on the piece they were going to play.
And I've heard that they did contests with new contemporary builders and trying to find out which one sounded most like a Stradivarius.
That's one of the things that has been studied a lot, and they've done very well-trained ears sitting on the side, blind tests, sitting on one side of a curtain with very well-trained players on the other side, playing modern instruments versus classical instruments to see who can tell the difference. And typically they can't.
That's true. No one chose the right one. Now, I thought we had a drawing. We don't. We took it down.
Oh, it's
we have a drawing here of the instruments and the exactitude of the measurements.
Well, what you have there, this there's a company in London called, it's a publication, The Strad, it's called, and they periodically publish posters. And on the reverse side of each poster will be very exact dimensions of each part of the violin.
I don't know if you can see this or not, but it's...
And violin makers very often turn to those for guidance when they're making an instrument. Of course, when they're trying to copy that maker's instrument. And I don't mean to say that Stradivari and Guarneri are the only people that are copied. There are great makers at the same time and later who make wonderful instruments.
And are they using any other wood than this antique?
Pretty much it's all aged spruce and maple. In some of the larger instruments, occasionally a cello will be made with a willow back or a poplar or a wood like that, which just gives a different tone. Typically in a violin, though, it would be extremely rare, in my experience anyway, for somebody to choose anything but maple for the back of the violin.
I hate to be
But the top will always be spruce.
the toad at the garden party or whatever, but there's only a limited number of trees that will fit this exact description?
Well, you know, it's funny because somebody, you know, they always said Stradivari had a great advantage being so close to this wonderful source of old-growth wood up in the Alps. And somebody said, if you actually add up all the instruments made in Cremona during that golden period, when the Amatis started in the 1500s through the mid-1700s, it probably took 1 truckload of wood to do all those instruments. So it wasn't like they decimated the forest. I understand that World War II did more harm to those forests than violin makers could ever do.
Terrible.
So that's why most of the wood I understand now is coming from the Carpathian Mountains, which are in Eastern Europe.
Very interesting. And you must work with the schools here, with the Rhode Island Philharmonic School, or?
Well, you know, there's no direct affiliation. I do have relationships with those people, with Community Music Works over in the West End of Providence, which is sponsored by the Providence String Quartet. I don't know if you know those people.
Yes,
and
yes. They've been here.
Sebastian Ruth has done a wonderful job organizing what is basically free music lessons to all comers, kids from the West End of Providence, which is my neighborhood, so it's very close to my heart. So I do work with them. One of their alumni has started a similar program in Pawtucket. Rachel Panich has an organization catering to the similar population in Pawtucket. So I love working with them. Typically, I provide them with, I'll facilitate donations. A lot of people want to donate instruments, and I will steer them in the direction of those programs. And I will usually, well, I'll always donate the labor it takes to get the instrument into playable condition. And usually I ask the donor, the person that owns the instrument, to pay for the parts. So if it needs a set of strings, so I'll ask them to pitch in too.
What a neat idea.
Yeah.
And so people can bring instruments to you and they have a crack and they look like they're not usable, or they have a broken neck.
Yeah.
I assume, what are the other things? I mean, there are lots.
Oh, well, typically older instruments develop cracks in the spruce top. That's one of the most vulnerable parts of the instrument. I mean, you felt how delicate this is. And it's also a highly striated wood, and
So it breaks easily.
Easily cracks, yeah. A well-made top shouldn't crack, but it's also a well-assembled violin should crack, because the glues that are used, the proper glues, will usually break at other places before it'll stress the top enough to break. But cracks are inevitable. And so I spend a lot of time every day fixing cracks on violins.
Well, it's a wonderful career, and we thank you for your second career and for being
thanks.
here to talk with us. And now we're going to hear again from Tony, who's playing a fiddle, and you tell me that fiddles and violins are really the same instrument.
Fiddles and violins are the same thing.
And I
think,
did not know that.
Well, the Germans have 3 words, the Giga, the Violin, and fiddle. So they're all the same thing.
Tony Gutierrez. Thank you for watching Good News Rhode Island. Thank you to Tony Gutierrez and to Dennis McCarten for being here with us and telling us all about violins. We hope that you are finding good news in your neighborhood and that it's right around the corner from you, and actually that you'll help to make it. Have a good week.